is that okay with you guys to do it like that?
Yeah, we hear you clearly.
It was okay. So I mean, it's
Yeah.
okay that I talk a little
Yeah,
bit
yeah, we can
about
hear
the
you.
Yeah,
yeah
of course.
yeah,
Go
and
ahead,
it's
Professor.
it's of some interest perhaps too. You probably all know this stuff better than I do, but a few years back at my university here, the winner of the Nobel Prize for political science was Eleanor Ostrom, hmm? And she won the prize for trying to revive the commons uh, and argued about the tragedy of the commons, you know. And she is now we have a lovely new statue of her here. Uh, I wish I had a copy of that. That's quite nice. Uh, but anyhow, it's so the allegiance I have to the theme of the commons, even though I have been off on different directions, it's always part of my heart, and so but it moves me in a variety of directions, and so I'll say something today about a movie I just started last night on Netflix. Do you get Netflix?
Yeah,
You know what Netflix is?
Yeah,
yeah.
Yeah.
yeah, you
Well,
know.
there's something called the social dilemma, and it's I regard Facebook and Google as the modern, in many ways, the modern problem of the common good and the commons, and yet it also has insidious, nasty forces which are at work, and it's very complicated. It's the commons, but it isn't the commons because it's owned by a few people. And that was, of course, goes back to Ostrom's problem with the tragedy. Allegedly, there couldn't be a commons because it had to succumb to capitalist influences, selfish influences, and so forth. And so I thought I'd say something about the media of Facebook and Google uh, because uh, you guys are all wired, as we say. Everybody is so immersed in the technology. It's the new public space. But how public is it? That becomes both a philosophical and a moral and a political issue. So I thought I'd say something about that. And that I didn't discuss any of that in
Yeah,
the earlier
that's a
version.
great idea.
Yeah. And then what occurred to me too is that COVID uh, is made us aware here of the commons. When you live in a deeply capitalist country where it's taken for granted that you take care of yourself before you take care of anything else, and then you realize you have millions of people taking care of you who don't know you. Suddenly, I hope that there'll be an awakening, but I'm not sure there will be. But that's another question. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, what is interesting for me and impressing in your project is the relations between commons and the political. I mean, the ontology of political. Can you hear me?
I'm kind of deaf, but these earplugs are helping a little bit.
Uh-huh.
Try it again, Hamid. See how that works.
Is it okay right now?
A little
Can you hear
better.
me now? It's better. Is it better?
That's better.
Just
There's good. That's good.
okay. I was just mentioning this that what is very interesting in your project, in you, your Peter, and and the Daniel's project, Peter, you, and Daniel's projects, for me is the relation between common and the political. I mean, the ontology of politics or the political ontology. Uh,
I'm not
when I
hearing those
was
last words. So say those last words again.
I said the relation between the commons
Yes.
and the political ontology.
Oh, yes. That's yeah, yeah. You mean
That is
Husserl's ontology or
no political ontology regarding commons.
partial ontology? Is that the
Let me
word?
just drink my juice.
Political
Oh,
ontology,
political
Professor.
Mahmoud,
ontology. Political
keep going.
ontology.
I
Yeah,
will just.
yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Mahmoud, keep going.
Okay. It's that we are very fond of your ideas about the relationship between the commons and common goods and the foundation for political theory.
Yes.
You
Yes. I
know,
think. Yes. Thank you. Yeah, I think
yeah,
that's important. I think it's also for Husserl tied to not theology as such, but to philosophy of religion. I mean, uh, there's a kind of allegiance to a philosophy of religion that's somewhat Platonic because the ideas, Husserl has a unique take on the ideas, which are not, even though there's nothing that we can talk about apart from consciousness. Hmm? Nevertheless, the ideas are not, as for Kant, I'll say this all again, uh, merely functions of the mind. They are also constitutive of the mind.
Mm-hmm.
I've been working now, and it's just fascinating to me how I've been reading some other people, but for Husserl, what's been neglected, I mean, obviously the issue of truth is terribly important, but the way the mind is under the sway of the idea of the truth from the very beginning in every aspect.
Mm-hmm.
Objectivity, for example, is functioning in the passive flow of time and establishing the ideality of the now, you know, and but what he calls the idea of the thing we'll talk about. There is an expanse, an opening to the infinity of truth, and it's always working. There's always a kind of pressure, and and that's why the universal ethical love is also a ontological and a theological notion,
Yeah.
in at least philosophy of religion, and it's not a construct because we all experience it in ongoing in our life all the time. So I'm glad you appreciate that the commons is not uh, neutral in regard to metaphysics. It's
Mm-hmm.
uh, and I think the chief metaphysical concern is the one I've spent most time on is the metaphysics of the person. And
yeah.
so, but if I keep talking like this, I'll have said everything and I can go to bed.
We have
We
still
really
10
enjoyed.
minutes. Yeah.
Yeah.
What time is it
Professor
here?
Hart, we have 10 minutes to
Oh,
start
we
the
got
meeting.
lots of time. We've got lots of time. So,
You
how's
know,
the wet?
I had a sentence, I don't really like it. I always used to say that Plato, political philosopher, because of his epistemological treats, huh?
Hmm.
Dialects.
Who's this?
Yeah.
I,
Who are we
I
talking?
Plato,
Who?
Plato.
Oh,
Plato,
Plato. I'm sorry. Yeah,
Plato.
Plato. Yeah.
Platon is the right way to say it. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
You just pronounce it wrong. Yeah,
Yeah.
wrongly.
Yeah, I
Plato.
used to just I used to characterize a notion of political ontology based on theory of truth,
Uh, uh-huh.
and from there I started considering the Husserl's notion of truth.
Uh-huh. Uh,
And I try to say because truth in Plato, from Plato there,
Plato.
yeah,
yeah.
Plato, you say, from the beginning of the ancient Greeks, political philosophy is the key concept in political ontology. We can just
Ah,
criticize this history of ontology, political ontology, by using Husserlian understanding of truth.
yeah.
That is why I
Wow.
just
Good.
consider comments in your project.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's good. Good. Oh.
Actually, we are thinking about a new paradigm in political science. based on a new foundation, of course, on which we searching for it in phenomenological philosophy.
Oh,
If
wonderful.
if I may ask you, uh, how do you compare the Christian love of Max Scheler with the ideological love of Husserl?
What of Shaler's his political ontology?
No, no. I wanted to ask you, how do you compare the Christian love of Max Scheler, the
Uh-huh.
concept of Christian love in Max Scheler, and the idea of ideal ethical love in Husserl?
Yeah, I think Shaler is spends more time on the nitty-gritties, I think. Uh, and he this is a very good question because I I don't think Shaler. I mean, the chief difference I think is Shaler doesn't have a reduction to the transcendental ego. The I, that in this peculiar sense that it comes out in the reduction, uh, is becomes like the philosophical arena, uh, but it's never absolutely cut off from the person as it's lived in the natural attitude. Shaler never quite. Shaler only knows the reduction in terms of the reduction of the individuality, the actual existence, in order to get to the form, in order to get to the essence. So it's an eidetic reduction. Uh, Now that sounds like it's when it works itself out. Does it really mean any? Is there a significant difference in their positions? I'm not so sure. Uh, that I think Shaler. I felt, and I'm kind of cold on some of these things because I haven't looked at Shaler in quite a while. Uh, but the I think that the for one thing, they both seem to agree, and I wanted to say agree with me, but that's silly. But they both seem to agree with uh, what I didn't expect them to agree about the whole problem of individuality of the person. That is really crucial. And that's what I wrote 1,200 pages on with Who One Is. That there is a peculiar way, ultimately, what I say in the first person singular when I say I. And that's another thing. Do you guys in Farsi, do you have a uh, first person reference with something equivalent to I?
Yeah.
Because,
Yes,
okay,
yes,
good.
yeah.
Yeah, because I had to wrestle with that. I had one of my students knew Vietnamese, and you refer to the first person always indirectly. Uh, you can infer first person reference, but for example, you'd say if a son was speaking to his father, he wouldn't say I, use the first person singular. I guess they have something like a weak version of it. It's always the unworthy son, the unworthy second son of the honorable father who's across the table. So it's an indirect reference, So it's uh, getting a transcendental I out of the Vietnamese culture is very hard sometimes. Uh, so but I think it has to be possible. Of course, it's going to fly, but it must be harder. And I talk about that somewhere. It's harder to make them see the I as anything other than a silly kind of bias, you know. Uh, but anyhow, that the first person reference for both Shaler sees that the sense of the individuality, if I remember right, is not we aren't individuated by our being in place and in time. We're not, I mean, we are as persons, obviously, but the unique individuality of the person is other than being individuated sociologically or psychologically. And so that's what I talk about mostly in Who One Is. But it makes the advent of the we really a remarkable event, because this which cannot, or and the whole formulation of saying, for example, the other I, mm, is a very odd formulation, because in a sense for Husserl, the only I know is the first person I. And I can never leave the first person perspective in a sense. And so, but it's when it's reduced to the transcendental I, it's not the I of g.hart in the world talking to Hamid. Tell me your name again. Mahmoud. And Mahmoud talking together, and sipping water. It's the transcendental I where the world is reduced, and it becomes a manifestation. It becomes an appearing, not a mere appearing. It's being in its manifestness. So, and Shaler, so the point is that still Shaler saw this unique individuality. In that sense, then their ontologies would grow up together. And the problem of love and the problem of the we would be similar. So I didn't answer your question, but it's but I maybe I got close.
Mahmoud,
No,
oh gosh. I just want to ask everyone to turn off their video, please. دوستان لطفا ویدیوهاتون رو ببندید، همینطور میکروفون هاتون رو. I'm just sorry to interrupt.
No, I guess we'll begin pretty soon.
Yeah.
I don't want to
Mahmoud.
keep talking, Mahmoud, because I'll have said everything and I'll have to go to bed.
Okay, it was my fault to ambush you with that hard question.
Yeah.
From where? Yeah.
We'll come back to it.
Okay, thank you very much. We also enjoy your article about the phenomenology of violence.
Oh, thank you.
We really, it was great. Actually, it was great.
Yes.
How you describe the SARS account on this, and it was actually we are looking forward for another meeting if you honor us, and talking about this subject too.
Yeah, that we could be that issue. I looked up that I'm not sure. I'm not sure it's in the Quran or where, but there is a reference to Lucifer, and there is a similar figure that's in the Hebrew Bible, the Jewish Bible, and the Old Testament, we call it. And
Satan,
Satan. That's right. Yeah, and I found that Sartre's analysis of rage. How do you explain the madness of nuclear weapons? There has to be what I'm calling a Luciferian existential. What did you want me to do, Sweet Zero, about the 12:30?
Yeah, they're about to start.
Yeah. Okay. My wife says maybe I should be quiet for a while.
No, okay. We're just waiting for another participants to join us.
And then good. We're waiting.
Start.
Okay. We're waiting. Very good.
Okay. Please continue.
She knows once I get going, sometimes for me, time doesn't exist sometimes. That's her claim. Of course it exists.
Well, that's a relief.
That is what we really need, Someone who can say something can be the owner of the time, and you can say something. You are making and constituting the time. You are the time.
Thank you. That's very good. That's very good. A phenomenology of as a Skype conference.
So, Mahmoud, shall I begin?
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, Professor Hart, I'll just say something in short in Farsi to the participant, then I'll just leave you. Mahmoud starts, you give your presentation, and I'll back to you again. دوستان خیلی خوشحالم که در خدمتتون هستم. خیلی ممنونم که تشریف آوردید. خواهش میکنم که در طول ارائه پروفسور هارت لطفا ویدیوهاتون رو روشن نکنید، میکروفوناتون رو روشن نکنید. اگر پرسشی داشتید میتونید که توی پابلیک چت بنویسید به فارسی یا انگلیسی. در پایان جلسه ما اونا رو مطرح میکنیم. لطفا توی پابلیک چت زیاد چیزی ننویسید به خاطر اینکه پرسش دوستان گم نشه و ما بتونیم که همه اونا رو مورد بررسی قرار بدیم. خیلی لطف میکنید اگر ویدیوهاتون رو و صداتون رو باز نکنید. اگر این کار کردید من مجبور میشم که شما رو از کال ریموو کنم. میتونید دوباره جوین بشید بدون اینکه ویدیو و میکروفونتون روشن باشه. Everyone, please do not turn on your videos and microphones during the presentation. You can ask your questions at the end of the meeting, writing it on the public chat. Thank you, Mahmoud. It's just you and your time.
Thank you, Hamid. Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today. And on behalf of ISP, Iranian Society for Phenomenology, I wanted to thank Professor Hart for being with us today. It's an honor to have you here. I just start the meeting with reading an introduction, and then Professor shall start his presentation about the subject of common good, and afterwards you can ask your question in the public by typing it in the public chat. Thank you very much. Okay. In 1920, Bertrand Russell wrote in a letter, "People seem good while they are oppressed, but they only wish to become oppressors in their turn. Life is nothing but a competition to be the criminal rather than the victim." There are 2 points in the cynical quotation. First, a decisive non-ethical dichotomy, namely to be the criminal or to be the victim. That means to see the other's good as one's evil and vice versa. The second point is perceiving the world as a field for competition. While the former reminds us of how philosophers such as Hobbes and Nietzsche see the human life and morality, the latter is one of the most well-known characteristics of capitalism and neoliberal nation-states. However, this pseudo-logic of common life is not limited to liberal ideological worldview, while its traces could be unveiled in other modern ideologies as well. According to Max Scheler, even the socialist ideal of equality is based on a hidden and presumptive comparison between I and the other, which eventually ends up in a resentful competition that deteriorates the idea of universal love as the sole basis of true morality. But is there any escape route from this main and common trajectory? Can we redefine our social relations or common life in a way that it no more represents the competitive desire to overcome the will of the other in our favor? If we turn to the politics and political analysis, we may see the main problematics as in the case of morality. The main paradigm in political science focuses on the relations of power and state apparatus. In this respect, the ancient Greek idea of common good as the basis of common life in polis is basically undermined, or even worse, become a deceptive motto in favor of nation states. In this regard, Husserlian phenomenological accounts on political philosophy, which begins with ethical ontological necessities of living together in a community, shows a possibility of an alternative horizon, both in theoretical and practical aspects of the political. At the core of this new paradigm is an ethical out, the idea of universal love, the moral categoriality, which is to take others' good as yours and vice versa. Without this principle, there will be no common good, if any good at all. and consequently the community as a form of being would be destroyed. Therefore, we encounter a new foundation for politics, which is at the same time the ethical ideal and the necessary ontological basis for every community. In this sense, common good is not only a telos, but also a very origin of community and our perception of the world. In Iran, common good is currently a serious and problematic issue. There are different cases such as insufficient teamwork, carelessness towards or even damaging public property, preferring self-interest over commons, and etc., which are generally understood as cultural problems. Besides, all political parties try to address common good according to their worldview or ideological perspective. And unfortunately, that refrains all attempts to reach a consensus over the meaning and necessity of common good. In this situation, an ethical political philosophy that presents an account of good without referring to any pre-established ideology or even metaphysics would offer a solution to this socio-political dilemma. Today, Professor Hart is talking about the ontological necessity and different meanings of common good based on his account on Husserlian social ethics. As Professor Emeritus of Religious Studies at Indiana University, Professor Hart's long list of works present a communitarian account on transcendental phenomenology and introduce an anarchic communist theory in political theory. You can also find more detailed analysis of today's discussion in his book, The Person and the Common Life, which is published in 1992, particularly the last chapter, namely the common good of the common life of the godly person of a higher order. Thank you, Professor. You may begin now. Thank you for listening to me, and please answer.
Good. Well, Mahmoud, I want to thank you for that lovely introduction. It said about everything in a nutshell of what I wanted to say. So I'm tempted to be quiet, but I'll continue because you asked me to speak.
Thank you very much.
I want to thank Hamid also and all your colleagues for this opportunity, this honor to, and I'm looking at sort of just a blank screen, so I'm going to be a little conscious here. I apologize for not knowing any Farsi. I did get clarified that we do have rich supply of personal pronouns in Farsi, so all of my Husserlian reflections won't be in vain if I were to undertake them. And whenever I refer to them, they will be, I hope, still of interest. I want to begin with a different kind of reflection, which I haven't done before, which gets us back into our origins in Plato and Aristotle a bit, and then moves us up into the situation with which we're confronted today, or the various situations, which I think make the issue of the commons and the common good so much more relevant, perhaps, than they ever were. And even though the forces that militate against an attitude, a posture towards community, a common life, and common goods are also perhaps stronger than ever before. I have in mind, of course, totalitarianisms, but also capitalism. And what we do face today is, doesn't need to be said, something called the COVID pandemic, which in our part of the world is blazing. And one of the key reasons why it's blazing is an indifference to the common good or a denial of the common good. And then we're also facing no less great catastrophe, namely climate change. The science is in on that. There's no debate on it. If we don't do something, the planet itself and our species is at stake. And then, of course, another crisis is nuclear weapons. We keep building nuclear weapons, and it seems that it's in my country's foreign policy bag. It seems to be the first tool they let peek out of the bag to intimidate. So we have and there's a proliferation of, and there's no serious involvement in getting a demilitarization, a deep getting rid of nuclear weapons. It seems to me was as important as facing the climate change and the pandemic. Okay, so let me begin then with looking briefly at Plato and Aristotle as forebears on our issues. In Plato and Aristotle, the fundamental issues of political theory, or the state, or the city-state. It's interesting, the term here that in English we translated Plato's great book, great dialogue, the Republic, we call it. And this is a wonderful word that comes from the Latin, and it's politeia, I believe, in Greek. The polis is stuck in there, and so the Romans translated polis and the politeia in terms of the res publica. It's a wonderful word, the common thing, the thing which we all have in common, we regard in common, we cherish in common. So we wouldn't have a republic, we wouldn't have anything like a political organization or even a social organization unless we had this notion of community and commonness. Okay, so in Plato and Aristotle, the fundamental issues of the theory of the res publica, the social arrangement beyond the family, friendship, and the village, which both Plato and Aristotle regard as pre-political, is discussed in its then extant known versions, namely monarchy, oligarchy, tyranny, and democracy. In Aristotle, the latter, democracy, was regarded skeptically as a rule by the mob or masses. This is tied in part to his conviction, and it's still an important one, that the rulers and yes, let's call them the rulers here, the governors, the spokespersons, would be people with excellence, arete. And that's our word, aristocrat comes from that, the oligarchy. And excellence of virtue is what he would have liked in his utopia. He was, after all, not pretty freely to speak, pretty free to speak, I think, even though he was the tutor of Alexander the Great, the emperor. But in any case, I don't know the details of that. But it seems to me that his preference for a kind of oligarchy, but it was tied very much to a moral excellence. Now but then the issue arises: who says? And we have the ensuing 2,500 years trying to come up with an answer to that question. But he did, and it echoes, of course, what we had in Aristotle echoes what we had already in Plato's wish for the philosopher king. We have, and the philosopher was the one who sought wisdom, pursued wisdom. She didn't claim to be wise. I'll say she, although they were pretty, as you know, patriarchal, very patriarchal, and women were basically invisible. So later history would see, especially with the increase in numbers and complex economies, attempts at variations of these original array of oligarchy, tyranny, democracy, which never got off the ground. Because of the increase in numbers and complex economies, a whole notion of economy, which I want to talk about a little bit, we found attempts at variations of these, plus new combinations. For example, we had constitutional monarchies. We had mixes of theocracies and oligarchies, as in the Christian Middle Ages. Uh, we had monarchies, obviously, and limited representative democracies today. We have capitalist oligarchical representative democracies as in America. We have central party state socialism, and we don't know exactly what's going on in either China or Russia right now because of the oligarchs or the central party people seem to look more and more like Wall Street investors, and besides being sometimes, central party members. We had democratic socialism in Northern Europe and Southern Europe, a great part. So Aristotle and Plato would have found the communitarianism or social anarchism of some modern people, and I'm inclined in that direction, to be pre-political, pre-statist, and as therefore pre-political forms of living. And I think that's the challenge. I don't think we want the municipalities to define human beings because there's also a hidden line in Aristotle. I'm not going to pursue it now. But once you get beyond a particular size, if you want rule by the people, it becomes very hard. Representation is a problem. And we'll come back to that later when we start talking about the meaning of we. Okay. So the city-states required kinds of organization and cooperation different from that of friendships and families and villages. As you got larger, and of course Greece was growing, and then Rome, you had larger populations, and you had you didn't have the perhaps the simplicity that you would have with a village or a collection of villages, a federation of villages. You had something as my I think one of America's treasures in political thinking, Lewis Mumford. You had starting the emergence with empires into the mega machine. The mega machine is his term for what's happened increasingly in the West. Now, okay. So here I want to call attention to a prophetic moment in Aristotle. In many Western language, the word for economics comes from the Greek word for householding, or maintaining one's livelihood in regard to one's house and or home. For Aristotle, wealth does not make sense if it is equated with money. And that was beginning. There was an emergent commercialism, mercantilism that was made him very nervous, to say the least. For Aristotle, health does not make sense if equated with money. Okay, his facing such an equation reminds me of Husserl's wrestling with irrationalities and like irrational numbers or the absurds in life. Money is a means of exchange for Aristotle. It stands for something else. When the useful item is acquired by money, the money is spent. Money itself is not anything. It stands for something. In this sense, it is a non-thing, a non-entity. How can money be wealth? He asks, and people have asked for millions of years, if one who is rich in money can starve. Aristotle seems to be saying, and this is central for our discussion today, that economics disconnected from household economies and subsistence economies, and this disconnect from commerce in the forms of relationship to the labor which produces useful goods, is a nonsensical abstraction. The household activities have always finite goals, he says, like satisfying one's hunger. The emerging commerce that Aristotle was concerned about, he compares to medicine insofar as there's no limit, no definite end to tending to your being healthier and taking care and doing healthful things. Thus, people who confuse the issue and think of economics proper in terms of commerce see the household as needing to increase without limit. But living well in the household is living toward finite goals, he reminds us. It is the bewitched householder who thinks of living in terms of infinite desires. It's this person who confuses fundamentals. And then he goes on to say, quote, and since their desires are without limit, they also desire that the means of gratifying them to be without limit. And therefore, I say, paraphrase, they need the art of commerce for the household, an art which promises excessive gratification. Here we come upon an eerily prophetic uneasiness in the one who was called by our ancestors for nearly 2,500 years, the philosopher, the master of those who know. Aristotle clearly was ill at ease with the rise of this commerce and what it does to what he sees as a natural order. The uneasiness is intensified when we consider his meditation on interest taking or usury. Here, the unnaturalness of the autonomy of the economy tied to the emergent commerce comes to the fore. Whereas money and commerce came into being for the sake of exchange of possessions, with interest, usury, one acquires goods from money itself and not from the goods of labor for which money was supplied. Interest as money making money creates money from nothing, he says. And this is why it is, quote, most contrary to nature and most reasonably hated. That's in the Politics. Yet it must be said that Aristotle, who after all was the tutor of Alexander the Great, encouraged the rise of the wild abstractness of business as commerce because he detached the proper life of the member of the polis and the philosopher from the household economy and subsistence activity. That work was the unfree labor best suited for women and slaves. Today, in most capitalist societies, we have a loss of the polis as the res publica, the common life, the common thing, built around common goods, because of the triumph of commerce and the pervasive ethos of competition in every aspect of life, but especially in the acquisition of power and status through money. But this is only possible if what today we call the commons are resources for investments. We probably won't get to talk about the tragedy of the commons. I just wanted to mention that at my university, there was a remarkable thinker who died a few years back, just after she got the Pulitzer Prize, the Nobel Prize for economics. A Nobel Prize for political science. On the topic of economics. Maybe it was the Nobel Prize for economics because of her work in political science. That's what it was, I think, on the commons. And the tragedy of the commons is, as you know, it's the picture of someone of a community. And her area of study was Switzerland, and you had this land which was used for everything. They would graze on it, they would grow crops on it. And then the tragedy commons comes up from a philosopher's proposal or a political sciences proposal that, okay, gee, we have this big chunk of land here, and we each have a cow out there for our homes. I bet if I put 2 cows out there or 3 cows out there, I could have much more money. I could have much more wealth. But if everybody did that, would put out another cow or another two cows, the commons would be destroyed. And this became the kind of metaphor, the basic analogy for why any kind of communal thinking, communal undertaking is impossible. And Professor Ostrom, in fact, showed that for 800 years in the cantons of Switzerland, they worked this out marvelous. They protected the water, they protected the woods, they protected the commons and everything. And they did this for 800 years. So there cannot be anything inevitable about the tragedy of the commons, was her argument. Okay. So let us return briefly to Plato. In the work, what we translate in English as the Republic, the largest dialogue, is exemplary insofar as he attempted, perhaps for the first time, what is now a recurrent genre and an interesting genre. I used to teach a course on utopian literature, and Plato sort of began that with the Republic. And there's lots of interesting literature in the direction. If we could talk about that, I think for those of you who become teachers, it's a wonderful way to get into basic issues. You get the dystopian and the utopian literature. Dystopias are easier to write than utopias, by the way. That's interesting. But one of the earliest is the News from Nowhere, and the name of the author right now is escaping me. But it's okay. A lot of things escape me these days. All right. So in the Republic, he speaks of for the first time of an outline of an ideal society, which was also a treatise on the art of government and a rule. In this dialogue, there's also the dialogue called The Statesman. It's connected very closely with the Republic, and he regarded the work of, and this is interesting, the work of, and this is a celebration of you all, and our common vocation and our common interests. He regarded the work of devising a state and conceiving the best rule of the state in a way, and this is, don't forget, this is a person who is intoxicated with metaphysics, is intoxicated with ideas. And it's very interesting that the beginning, as it were, of political science is a combination of philosophies and metaphysics and political science. I find that intriguing because as I draw nearer to death, metaphysics interests me increasingly, but my hankering interest for politics and the common good and the political dimension still hangs on, and how to bring them together. Well, this was the beginning of philosophy, bringing together metaphysics and political science, and I think Husserl has something to say about that. So in the dialogue, The Statesman, we read then, this greatest of all human achievements, he said, to bring together human beings in fellowship is the greatest of all human achievements. We read, in a fellowship of concord, and by ties of friendship, its kingly weaver, the philosopher king, maintains his control and oversight over the res publica, over the city-state, and it lacks nothing in his design that makes for human happiness, as so far as human happiness is obtainable in a human community. Okay, now I want to get to another issue it's connected to the commons, but it's pressing on me as an America that seems to, in America right now, that seems to be falling apart. It's the issue of truth and politics, and it's obviously connected with the commons. And I think it's, and I'll be saying this again, but it just struck me as so obvious that I overlooked it, I think, oftentimes enough, that a chief, if not the most important common good is the truth. And it's by definition common. Now, Husserl does have an argument for our individual calling, our unique absolute ought, as being uniquely true, the truth of our one individual will and not the truth of anybody else's individual. It's a beautiful doctrine. So there is a kind of truth which is not common because it's the truth of who you are in the eyes of God, so to speak. It's a lovely doctrine. So, and that might be the one truth, the truth of one's own will, which is not common. It's not a common good. It's the good which is uniquely true for oneself. However, the common good of the truth, the very nature of say the truth as we come to know it in any science or any good discussion, is that what's true for everybody. It's true for all. And that's what's coming undone, I think, right now in the United States. So the chief challenge early on for both Plato and Aristotle was to establish unity and harmony among radical diversity and individuality. Philosophers strive to bring out the necessities and the universals or essences in life and in nature. But as Sheldon Wolin, who wrote a lovely book called Politics and Vision, Wolin, Sheldon Wolin, as he points out, Plato and Aristotle both recognized that political decisions are rarely of a general kind in the sense that the individuals or groups affected are treated exactly the same. That is, such policies as general agreements involve general classifications, and often enough, some individuals are discriminated against. And we think of the whole civil rights movement throughout the world. It's only been, how many years has it been? 150 years since women's suffrage in the United States. Wolin also quotes Leo Strauss, another very interesting political philosopher, that whereas agreement may produce peace, say political agreement, it doesn't produce truth. Reaching an agreement through participation binds a community by a consensus, but not necessarily by truth. If one person whose decision is accepted as valid makes the decision, there's no an effective realization of a person's will. So here we have it's captured, of course, in what we call the royal we. When a king speaks, he can use, or a pope speaks, they can use a royal we. But the problem with that, and I try to analyze that in the person of common life, is that to say we, properly speaking, the speaker not only has to have in mind, in what Husserl would call an appresentation, the others, or an act of empathy, the others, but he has to represent them with their consent. Otherwise, it becomes royal we. Otherwise, it becomes an editorial we, and it's a huge presumption. And of course, that's how history bore itself out, that people felt that other people were speaking for them. And this is the problem of representative democracy and the so-called representative democracies, that the individuals are rarely represented because their representatives are owned by someone else, let's say. So in a sense, even in representative democracies, we don't have democracy, because representation itself is in many ways problematic. And this is the problem of political science, to get it right on size and the mechanisms of representation. And how big may we get? And then what are the subdivisions? You all know that, your political sciences. A parliamentary decision may be effective. There might have been an agreement, and public, because agreed upon by the representatives. But it doesn't mean that it's agreed upon by all of the subjects. And that's Aristotle's problem too. Can all the subjects ever agree? In such cases, a political judgment is public in the sense of the rule binding upon all. As such, it has the status of political truth. but it is not public. And in this sense, it is not true when it accords to some standard external to politics. So you have a political truth, which is based on an accord, a kind of consensus. But as we said earlier, that doesn't necessarily make it true, especially, let's go to the COVID pandemic. We have deniers that there is a pandemic. We have deniers about all the science of public health that mask wearing is important, that social distancing is essential, and so forth and so on. And that would save us apart from that if you bring in issues, say, of even ethics and social justice or religious teaching into the issues, let's say, of nuclear war and foreign policy. Doesn't count, not there. That doesn't have any validity. The equation of political reality and truth with political decisions and political power means that a scientific fact, a philosophical argument, even the cogito, I suppose, as such, even though true in terms of the most robust forms of evidence, these are not politically true and are irrelevant to the political realm and generally treated as such. This is strikingly evident in the COVID-ridden United States today, with the resistance to both science and public health theories. Perhaps, but wider is there is ever a discussion of the ethics of capitalism in the United States, in these democracies, liberal democracies. So it gets a free pass in terms of quote unquote external truths of sociological arguments, for example, regarding the so-called happiness index used by the Scandinavian countries, to say nothing of philosophical, ethical reflections on social justice and nuclear weapons and so forth. In the present case of the COVID pandemic, we in the United States have a conflict between the political truths of local versus federal governments and libertarian groups of numerous stripes. But all of these together, sometimes in conflict with one another, but also with science and public health theories regarding the safest procedures to control the virus. Here one can see the basis for the inclination to substitute, at least temporarily, a monarchy, an oligarchy, or tyranny in opposition to this failing form of democratic rule. But again, the issue is the loss of an appreciation for a common life, for a community, and common goods. Plato sought to establish the philosophical truths as the norm for political decisions. This is why he proposed rulers, kings, should be philosophers. At the seem to have large populations tempted to think of all truth as relative to political or individuals' decisions or whims. The truth of the public realm is not only to the decision makers, is not only tied to the decision makers, but also who owns the public realm? Who owns the space of appearing, the space of interaction between the citizens? Now we're getting to the issue of the media, the new commons, the new public forum. Very recent relative in some ways. I mean, we've had radio and TV for quite a while, but there's something happening now, especially with the invention of the computer and the smartphones, so forth. Okay. The true public realm, wherein political truths are generated and discussed, the true in the sense of the actual public realm. I'm moving realm from what happens, say, in a Congress or the official representatives of the people. I think increasingly the true public realm, wherein the political truths are discussed and which found, in some sense, what later becomes formulated in terms of laws and political decisions in the official bodies is this whole new realm of the media. Thus, the truth of the life together, of our life together, is connected to the power and ownership of the media. And these, it must be said, are often in collaboration with the elected rulers because both these elected rulers and the media are beholden to the same financial powers, at least in my neck of the woods. With significant exceptions, right now in the United States, the hegemony of the common public realm, understood as the decision-making government bodies as well as the media, is in favor of corporate capitalism's interests. And I just learned and we saw part of it last night, we'll see the rest of it tonight. I just learned of a new Netflix documentary, Social Dilemma, The Social Dilemma, Dilemma. It is about the new public spaces or commons, Google and Facebook, for example. Here is shown how the old problems with both state-owned media as well as privately owned media are raised to a new level. A great number of Americans spend a good part of their day in this new marketplace, in this new public space where they meet friends, hear jokes, learn what's interesting, what the decisions really mean in Congress, and some foibles of distinguished leaders. So what's going on, as we say, is learned about in this new marketplace, which is provided by the modern technology and Google and Facebook. A great number of Americans spend a good part of their day acquainting themselves with the world, finding a way to live together in spite of spatial separation by, for example, Googling or being on Facebook. Instagram's another one. There's a whole list of them. I don't know about them. I stick to email. But they're becoming evident. Chiefly media individually tailor their contents increasingly. That's what the movie's about. In a way, state-owned or privately owned media, for example, TV or radio, a radio channel, TV channel or radio channel, they cannot tailor their presentations in the way Facebook and Google can. This is because the owners of Facebook and Google have the ability to develop a remarkable, distinctive profile on each user on the basis of what the user's interests and habits appear to be in the past, and thereby they can determine the daily diet of news, information, and entertainment about not only the common thing, the res publica, the state, etc., but also about local news and gossip and personalities. They feed individuals and groupings of people what they want to hear on the basis of having accumulated a biography of every Facebook or Google user. The motives behind this external determination of truth of the common world and common life is unclear. Surely many of the motives are laudable, unquestionably. They provide users with the best information, for example, on where to buy at the best price a drug or a vitamin. In great part, however, the motivation is financial. But clearly, as perhaps the last years have shown, the owners of the media have themselves or have permitted others to pursue personally harmful or politically disruptive behavior and thus undermine the social order of the country in which the interlocutors or the users live. Has become weaponized. Here we have a common good, important media, a marvelous invention, making our lives often wonderfully comfortable or our work very much more easy. and that's for good for all because it enriches and facilitates both the individual lives as well as the common life, and providing what we can call common goods, which are, we're going to say, essentially common: stories, jokes, important information. Eventually we're going to have maybe the virus come out now, the formula for the virus, art. Okay. But the media themselves, the technologies, uh, are not for what we call the common good. They're not for the common good. They are rather, or they're not for the well-being of each within the whole. They are for these private interests, mostly money-making interests. This is a rich, complex issue, and there is need for more philosophical, phenomenological analyses and social and ethical reflection on this complex common good. Maybe some of you have already undertaken this work, and I would very much like to see it. But when the creators of wealth, the workers, and the protectors of well-being of everyone, the frontline workers right now in the pandemic in the hospitals, themselves are endangered by the pandemic because we are in fact facing such disunity, this multiplication of truth, and destruction of the public realm and a common good, because of the common truth of the common good. We have competing interests which destroy the unity, and the norm emerges that truth is relative. Indeed, there are, as we hear in Washington, in the United States, there are alternative truths. And the truth is clearly not at one with itself, which is the end of thought, and even being wakefully and morally conscious. If one believes this, if one believes that all these things, that there is no truth, or truth is what some people in Washington would have us believe, then the non-political truths of external forms of evidence, science, for example, are to be assigned the status of just one more competing opinion. And philosophy just becomes an opinion among many. Suddenly, the notion of a scientist king, the substitute for Plato's philosopher king, seems to be, and perhaps is for many, five options. Our external political process reign over the public realm. But this, of course, is its own disaster. This is the source where you have a society led by technocrats. Say, for me, they'd be mostly materialist technocrats. God would be dead. There's no question of immortality. There's no question of spirit. And we would have a total institutionalism and hegemony of reductionist science, which would be then the end, I think, of the human spirit. And it would be, and human life would be cheap. Okay. Now I want to talk about the transcendental phenomenological task, the common good, and politics. Bring these together. Husserl's phenomenological philosophy, in the great part, moves in the direction of Plato insofar as he appeals to essential true considerations. At least this is our reading of Husserl, insofar as we are correct in seeing him focus on the common life and the common good as the key considerations for the political and the art of government. He doesn't say it quite like this, eh? So we're so to speak, putting words in his mouth. The common good and common life have universal and necessary, essential, true features, which ought to guide the ordering of the polis or the res publica, our common thing. That is to say, the common thing of our life together. The proposals made here regarding the common good, here meaning in our outline, which we'll hopefully get to, the proposals made here regarding the common good of the commons, the common life, are evidently true for all citizens, regardless of their background or of philosophical training or their training in political science. In this sense, they are universally accessible with or without political decisions. Here we briefly introduce these basic distinctions, which we will attend to more in detail later. Our focus in this paper is the common good. The expression itself suggests, as we have indicated, that we have to do with one thing, not a plurality. But insofar as we are insofar as the well-being and the community living life well together may be thought of as a single whole, the common good need not be misleading. Nevertheless, our consideration entails a plurality of considerations and senses of the common good. First of all, there seem to be two basic types. In both of these types, the goods are common or universal, but they are so in different ways in these two types. In the one case, the goods are essentially common in their very nature, in the sense that they have necessarily also an ideal existence as their component. That's not true of the other group, of the other type, which we're going to come back to. That is, although they are available only in their embodiments or expressions, they are never exhausted when their physical means of expression is exhausted, and they are never, of course, diminished in their being used by great numbers of people. So let's pause here for a brief minute on this idea of ideality. Of course, sociological investigations. Consider how we may regard truth as good, as the good of the mind or the intellect. Consider the claim of the public health scientist. Here it is, the quote. The best that citizens can do during the pandemic is to practice social distancing and wear masks in public or on occasion of contact with friends or strangers who are not part of one's home or household. This is what Husserl would call a proposition. It lays claim to being true. 350 million citizens in the United States have heard it and presumably understood what the words mean. Many times it was spoken in Spanish. At least half have believed it to be true. The same is true for Europe and perhaps East Asia, probably more Asia have heard it. It is debatable how many regard it as true, but conceivably 1 billion on the planet. But note the identically same proposition is given in, let's say, 50 different languages by endlessly different speakers at different times. Its importance, its truth are not diminished by the various languages in which it is conveyed, nor is its importance and truth diminished by the number who share in it. But of course, the propagators of the proposition may weary and die. The airwaves and electronic waves that communicate it in the various media may wear out. But its truth remains true. But notice even a false proposition and or a lie is still an ideality. And its being false remains throughout the different languages and the different number of people who hear it. That is to say, it remains true that the proposition is false, and this falsehood can be shared by endless number of people. Even in the year 2022, when, let's hope, the proposition about the necessity of social distancing and masking is no longer true and necessary and important, it remains true, and forever it remains true, that in 2020 it was true, necessary, and important that we mask and practice social distancing. Of course, the goods which are necessarily common by their nature, that is, have this ideality, are not just true propositions. Artworks may create possible or imagined fictional worlds. For example, Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. But consider also one of my favorites, Gustav Mahler's Fourth Symphony, which I believe to be a utopian, to present a utopian future. I believe it has artistic beauty and truth which transcends the time of its creation, its performances, the supporting artists, etc. And as such, regardless of my interpretation that it has a utopian future. And it points to a utopian future. And furthermore, Mahler's Fourth diminished in being enjoyed by every people, nor would it in itself as an ideal entity be diminished for those interpreting it as I do, if it turns out that my interpretation was wrong. These necessarily common goods, because they are ideal goods, and they are the goods of our life together, are clearly goods relevant for the common life, because without them, the life together in common is impoverished, if not moribund. Consider a joke, a visual artwork, a good movie, or not even a bad movie, a beautiful story or a bad story, a formula for COVID vaccine. These take numerous forms, have endless communicators, and they realize the same things. They are all things we enjoy together. They enrich our lives together. They typically define how we are going to spend the best hours or the best hours of the day. The best hours for me is that, when I have energy. If you have work to do, then we have what we call time from labor or leisure time. Leisure doesn't mean time off work, basically, for the Greeks. It means the time for where you pursue that which is good in itself. And that I want to suggest having leisure time is a common good in a good society, because we all need it. That when we could pursue what's good in itself and when we're at our best. That shouldn't be the privilege of the rich. Of course, de gustibus non disputandum est, as the Latins would say. Of course, we can't argue about tastes, and tastes differ. That is to say, these common goods that I might prefer might be of no interest to fellow citizens, or of only interest to very few. But they have this essential nature of being essentially common. What destruction of the commons and the environmental issue. In short, an infinite number of people can share in the beauty of a poem, an idea, a symphony, and there's no diminishment of the beauty or delight these give. But when the whole city shares in a banquet made for one family, the good is diminished. The prepared banquet has for this family the goodness created by the excellent cook and the goodness of nature's nutrition through the fruits of the earth. It brings about not only renewed strength, this meal, but also a wonderful satisfaction and a feeling of well-being. On the other hand,
Professor, you're muted.
Sorry, Professor, your microphone is just be muted. Can you turn it on again? We don't have your voice. No, still we don't hear you.
How's that? that
Yeah,
better?
it's okay now.
I don't know
Yeah,
what I
thank
did.
you.
I'm terribly sorry. I don't know what I did.
It's okay.
Uh,
It's okay.
okay, so we're making that basic point that the second class of goods uh, is diminished the more that consume them or enjoy them, and not so with the first class of common goods. But they're both commonly necessary. One is commonly necessary because of its essence. The other is commonly necessary because it's necessarily common. We all need it in the most elemental way of needing it. Okay. So, in short, an infinite number of people can share in the beauty of a poem or an idea, a symphony, and there's no diminishment of the beauty or delight these give. But when the whole city shares in the banquet for the family, the good is diminished. I read all that, didn't I? Okay. It would seem this basic division of common goods applicable to politics does not derive by way of political decisions or consensus, but by reason of what might be called a common sense. Hannah Arendt develops a notion of common sense along these lines, and that's worth pursuing.
Uh, Professor, you're muted again.
Sorry, Professor. Uh, you're muted again. Sorry, it was my fault. I think I accidentally muted you. Can you just unmute yourself? Thank you, Julia.
So that's what I have to press read that thing?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Sorry,
Yeah,
folks.
yeah.
Okay, I'll go back. Well, I think that my point is that uh, I think that these basic distinctions are obvious. People have lived with these distinctions all their lives. You don't have to be a philosopher or you don't have to be a public health person. This is perfectly obvious. And so in this sense, it's we don't have but we don't reach the obviousness by reason of a consensus. I mean, it's just there. It's presupposed everywhere. And I want to say that it's kind of the essence of the common life are these common goods, and it's certainly anybody who goes shopping and anybody who says, so what are we going to do today to enjoy ourselves? They make use of these distinctions. And I think that what Husserl a Husserlian point would be that there is a kind of eidetic intuition which is obvious and comes with living, and I think it's only ideologies then that would snuff these distinctions or pretend that it's an issue which only experts can or deal with. So my point then is basically that in this common sense, the manifest essences of these goods are at least implicitly recognized, and we are called upon to recognize and respect them if we are to pursue the kind of social political arrangements we most want to have, and in fact do have in great measure. At this point, we may remind ourselves that we present here a transcendental phenomenological theory of politics and are not presenting or achieving political decisions. We are not reaching a consensus among the interlocutors seeking unit, and we're not having any interlocutors here. I'm doing all the talking. Okay. Uh, we are not reaching a consensus among the interlocutors seeking unanimity or majority on what is phenomenologically true or what phenomenology or philosophy should look like. For Husserlian phenomenology, the ultimate setting for the discernment of evidence is the transcendental I. This philosophizing I reflects and analyzes in the attitude of the quote unquote transcendental reduction. That is, it works within the framework within which what appears or is manifest is considered inseparably from how it is manifested. That's the key phenomenological what do you want to call it, shibboleth, basic principle. What appears is inseparable from its appearing and the one to whom it appears. So it works within the framework within which what appears or is manifest is considered inseparably from how it is manifested by and to an agent of manifestation, the transcendental I. For our purposes, a central consideration connected to that of the common good is how the we emerges out of the necessity of acknowledging intersubjectivity or the plurality of transcendental I's, and how generalization or intersubjectivity gives rise to its social forms. So now we're going to make a transition here to phenomenological theology or philosophy of religion to bring out this point. And we're still continuing the tradition, the problem, the burning problem, really, of the truths of the political realm. If there's a temptation to reduce them merely to the consensus or to the opinions of the representatives of the political realm. Let me say that in general, there are not a lot of students of Husserl who have taken any interest in his philosophy of religion or phenomenological theology, but there have been some, and some very good ones. But when it comes to his social thought, the philosophy of religion may not be neglected. And that's in a sense the tie with Plato more than Aristotle. The rooting of the display of the transcendental we in the agency of the transcendental I is not egotism. It's not a moral failure. It is not a moral or ontological subordination of others to myself, but rather it is recognizing that qua philosopher, we is manifest to and by me as the transcendental I. It is also reflection on what the personal pronoun means, and the personal pronouns, plural, mean, and how they interrelate. I spend a lot of time on this, and I'm tempted to go off on it, but I won't now. This is appreciating that founding evidence is always first personal. Even when I'm talking in the third person or in the second person, addressing you or addressing him or thinking about him or her, it's still first personal. I'm never outside the first personal perspective and therefore implicitly the transcendental I. It is appreciating that founding evidence is always first personal, and to the extent it is rooted in others, even if the evidence that I have now has been acquired from you, my best friend, or my wife, or my lover, its phenomenological status is nullified. In other words, if my evidence is rooted only in your point of view or in some revered authority, it's not phenomenology. It has to be first personally evident. That is true even if it is a most important non-negotiable truth, as in a testimony by a trusted friend or a fortiori in a revelation from God delivered by sacred scripture or by God's prophets or special representatives. Thus, we do not side with the phenomenologists. In this case, I think it's basically Levinas and Michel Henry, who say the I is an accusative. It's derivative. It's a me in the grammatical sense before it is a nominative agent of manifestation and a practical agent of world transformation. Now, here's where the work of empirical science, of child psychology is of great importance, the predominance of the other, how we can't have an I, a child using first-person reference until it is socialized and so forth. it learns to could speak of itself in a third person reference and not grasp first person reference until an adult intervenes and so forth. And there's no doubt, it seems, that adults are necessary for the conditions for the properly human development of a child. Feral children, children raised by wolves, these Peter has written on this, I think, are never quite human in the sense of intellect and moral integrity. Of course, in a theological context, that of the Abrahamic religions, by the way, this is a book that I'm very fond of, that a friend, or at least a colleague, I've met him a couple of times. He's a priest who has learned Arabic, and he also is was the chair of the philosophy or theology, I think, at Notre Dame University. It's called the Towards a Jewish, Christian, Muslim Theology. It uses the basic distinction of Bob Sokolovsky, perhaps the most distinguished Husserlian phenomenologist, when he does philosophical theology. What he called the Christian distinction. Dave Burrell, the author of this book, amplifies the Christian distinction, as Sokolovsky draws it, to the theological distinction between God and the world. And it's so fundamental, but the distinctions are so precise. If I got off on that, we would lose the topic of our paper. But I just want to recommend it, that this book. I think the basic point is there is no daylight between the great medieval Muslim theologians, Hebrew Jewish theologians, and the Catholic Christian theologians on the basic idea of God's relationship to the world. And therefore, in the Abrahamic religion, there is a commonality of understanding God, and it can't be a basis for war. Okay. Yeah, where were we? Levinas. Yeah. Okay. Of course, in the theological context, that of the Abrahamic religions, for example, the transcendental I is created. But if this is a phenomenological accusative, this is a little tricky here, but if this is understood as a phenomenological accusative before it is a nominative agent of manifestation, that would somehow mean the first personal standpoint would be in play, passively existing, aware of its receiving the agency of the creator. But in such a view, there is the theological problem of the creature existing independently prior to the creator's creation of the creature, receiving, and the creature receiving antecedently its existence prior to its being created. Because we say that all the time, creatures, receive their existence, but it's partly misleading if you think that it implies that you have to exist in order to receive anything. One would somehow exist prior to one's creation in order to receive the creation. That is, one would already have to be, in order that one be an accusative, a me, receiving the agency which creates one's status as an agent of manifestation or transcendental I. Now, Husserl was very interested in the problem of immortality and how do we think of ourselves prior to our beginnings or after we've died. And some of his, for me, most interesting analyses have to do with that. But we won't do that today. Husserl maintains, while explicitly disavowing any interpretation which raises a suspicion of an intended blasphemy on his part, that the subjective a priori, as he calls the transcendental I, precedes the manifestation of the being of God and the world. That is, the manifest being of everything, individually, collectively, is manifest only by being manifest to or for me, the thinking, feeling, willing subject. Even God, the loving creator of heaven and earth, is for me what God is in consequence of my own agency of manifestation, my own conscious meaning productivity. That is, in my manifestation of being through life as surrounded by goodness, death, necessity, and chance. My encountering or being taught sacred texts, saints, sinners, etc., is a form of manifestation of the divine by me, even if the believer must also say that this very manifestation is itself a grace, an act of God's love. Husserl goes on to say that what we have here is a philosophical phenomenological problem. By this, he of course refers to the difference, on the one hand, between the sources and forms of evidence of truths, those of natural science, imagination, politics, faith, etc., all on one hand, and then philosophy on the other. All this is my paraphrase, a kind of a loose paraphrase of the passage, section 99 in the Formal and Transcendental Logic, where he briefly says this, and I paraphrase it here. So this somewhat lengthy consideration on the sources of political truth, which has led us to the source of religious truth, leads us to what here in the handout we have as the first sense of the common good. The first sense of the common good for Husserl is the way God is manifest ineluctably in every aspect of consciousness, but especially in the social ethical consciousness. So it's time for us to turn to the handout. I don't know if we want to take a little pause or not, but we got a lot to do still, and we'll finally get to the handout. So what do you say, Hamid? What do you want to do?
Professor, we have approximately 15 minutes. If you can manage to conclude,
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Oh, shall I keep going?
If you like to keep going, you can keep going.
I'm fine.
If you think
I feel now we can get to work. So
okay, so keep going. We are just listening. If you think you
Okay.
need to rest, okay.
I just did get a little sip of water. Okay. So now what I'm calling the first formal frame of the, and it's all under the rubric of this is also a basic sense of the common good. This is raises the issue of the Husserlian metaphysics when he in himself. And we have this now. When I first came across this, we had this only in the Husserl archives. I had to travel to Belgium, the Leuven archives in Belgium to get at this stuff. Now a good part of it's in volume 42 of Husserliana. Husserliana is typically abbreviated with HUA, HUA. Volume 42. Some of the best texts we find in there on Husserl's philosophical theology and the metaphysics of community. Okay, so we have then God as an idea. Now we have the basic point in Husserl that, as we said, that it talks about what appears in terms of its manifestation to me. But this is a little bit of a modification of that formulation, because what we have here with the idea, let's take for example the idea of God as bringing together the ideas of goodness and truth and unity. That these are this plurality of ideas are one with the idea of God, and God is functioning for in Husserl as using Aristotle's term, and he uses this term as an entelechy, the divine. He's using göttliche entelechy, the divine entelechy. It's a wonderful word that Aristotle, and it's usually translated in the metaphysics as actuality, but we don't do justice to the richness of this word. And he's, in the metaphysics and the philosophies of nature, he's talking about things which have a life, and therefore they have a beginning, a middle, and end, and they start off nascently, and their full life is implicit, but then it has to unfold into maturity and then into its age, according to the form it has. So the form of an animal is in the fetus, in the fertilized egg, but it's nascently there. It isn't evident at all. If you look at a fertilized egg of a human being, the humanity of the human being, the spirituality of the human being is not at all evident. We're going switch. We're going to push on for. So the actuality of the form in the, say, mature organism or the mature being, there is the actuality of that. He calls that the entelechy, but he's referring to how the form is. Telos. Entelechy has the word telos at the end, telekaya, but you have at the end, the form that's at the end, at the beginning. And one of my teachers in graduate school and my basic mentor for philosophy, Tom Proofer, said the entelechy is the having of the form within in a way which is not yet complete. But it's making it complete within itself is its actualization. It's actualizing into an actualization. The form for what we're talking about here is the idea of God. And the idea of God is not, and he's very dependent on Kant's regulative ideas, which is the most metaphysical aspect of Kant, I believe. And one of the neo-Kantians, Bruno Balk, wrote a lovely book on the idea. And for Kant, the regulative ideas are not constitutive, like substance is, like accident is, like relation is. Rather, they regulate the whole life of the mind. They are its fire. They are its dynamism. That's what keeps it ever pushing on. So for him, for Kant, freedom and God and goodness were all regulative ideas. They were never things, and they never came up for inspection. Husserl goes along with that in part. But for him, it's not merely rooted in the mind. It's transcendent to the mind. It's not merely regulative of the mind, it's constitutive of the mind. So our minds are constituted by the idea of truth, goodness, and unity, and therefore they're constituted, in Husserl's terms, by the idea of God. And God doesn't exist merely then as a mere idea. No, it's prior to. There's nothing we do in any of our activity which brings about the urge, the drive to verify. We do verify, of course. You say something to me. What do you think about that? I say, yes, that's true. I know such and such, and I can see such and such. That's the verification. But the urge to truth, the drive towards truth, the necessity of truthing, as it were, is not any particular act. That's there from the beginning. There from the very beginning. And so these ideas that we see, especially in Husserliana 42 and elsewhere, are constitutive of the mind, even though they are also the lure of the mind. So they're the entelechy. They're functioning at the very beginning, and they're throughout pushing towards and they are, for Husserl, they are infinite tele. They are infinite ideals. They are infinite in the Kantian sense too. That we've never become objects of experience in this life. They're always beyond, and it's not until you start to you perhaps think about, as you already have, what life is about, what politics is about. You realize it's an infinite field. It's inexhaustible. But if you don't keep moving with that inexhaustibility, you're not following, as it were, your your basic obligation as a philosopher to include the full truth. Mm. But it's always going to be partial in this life. Mm. Okay, now let me talk about briefly about the pole, because he talks about the idea as a pole of pole. In the very simple consideration of Husserl of a thing, it isn't a simple consideration, as you know, it goes on and on and on. But when we see a thing, we always see it from one side. You know, think of the book or glass, and there's always another side. But so you can see it from the top, you can see it from the bottom, you can turn it around in your hand, and you never fully see the thing. You see the thing in its totality of aspects, in its totality, as it were, of nuances. It's always more to see, and you can never see it all at once. Hmm? It's certainly true of a building. Think of. Let's go into a painting. You know, we have a painting of a three-dimensional world, let's say, and we're seeing it from this part, and then we see, well, yeah, but what about he's pointing, the artist or she's pointing to something else further down the line there. I have to see that. Hmm? And so, yeah, okay, but then we spend a half an hour, we spend 10 minutes at this painting, then we move to the next one, or we go to the statues and the sculptures. Hmm? And they too then present us with challenges, how best to see them. And when are we going to see the statue? Well, we can only see one thing at a time. So you see, emergent here is for Husserl, the thing, anything, is an infinite idea, an infinite ideal. We always fall short of perceiving visually the thing. Now, talk about the museum. We walk in the museum, we say, okay, I'll talk about I use museum, my university's museum, and you have these paintings, but each of these are things with infinite ideas. But now let's talk about the museum. Well, the museum, IU Museum, is that thing which is itself a pole, because it's a building, but it's also a building containing all these inner things. And by the way, there's not only the external horizon of anything, you know, especially when you're dealing with people, there's always the inner horizon. But when you're dealing with even plants, obviously, what all you see isn't all you get, so to speak, because they have organisms inside. And that complicates the seeing of a thing with an inner organism, with its infinite aspects, and the external organism. So with each thing, we have an idea with infinite profiles, infinite aspects. But when we're talking about the complexity of something like the world, or just the museum, or just my circle of friends, you have under my circle of friends, you have the multiplicity of infinite ideas brought together under one infinite idea that brings them together, but which itself is beyond them. It's just like the museum is a pole of poles, so my circle of friends is a pole of poles. And obviously, when you speak of your society, the Iranian Phenomenological Society, is a pole of poles. Now, Husserl extends this image then to the idea, the divine idea of perfection, the idea of truth, the idea of goodness. These are poles. The good, as Plato eloquently said, and there's a great philosopher, one of my favorite philosophers, Maurice Blondel, Blondel, wrote in 1893 a book called L'Action. It's been translated to most languages. I know it's been translated into French and German and English. Well, it is a French book, so it's translated into German and English. But the point about Blondel is how he shows so eloquently, and Husserl does this pretty good job of this too, how we are always in quest of greater good. There's always more. It's not just our appetite, like an appetite for food. There's always an intimation by something beautiful of even greater beauty. And that's where, if we have religious sensibilities, it becomes kicked in. So we then what we have then this idea of perfection, which is an idea, pole of poles. It embraces all the beauties, all the perfections, or in this case, all the truths. So let me just share this one kind of summary here. Just another word. He borrows here in say in volume 42 the scholastic notion of a transcendental. This is a nice term that Kant takes over. He means it for Kant, the transcendental is the realm of the minds constituting the world in terms of its basic categories of substance and accident, the relation, and so forth and so on. And but but he borrows the term from not forms a priori existing in the mind. No, he borrows it from the medievals, for whom, and Aristotle has a hint of this, of the transcendentals being words which are not synonymous with, but they are equivalents to, and they are ways of establishing correlations with being, which is the all of that which is. And the so for Husserl notes that the true, the one, and the good are notions that are convertible with being, and these the sense he extends the sense of these transcendentals to also encompass the constitutive a priori of the intellectual informing of the transcendental I and consciousness. Are we still there? Okay. Hamid, have I done something? Are we still in business?
What?
Are we still in business? Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah.
Professor. Yeah, we hear you.
Okay, good.
Please continue.
Okay.
الان ویدیو تو روشنه.
These transcendentals, I'm sorry I missed that. Keep going?
Yep.
Okay.
Keep going.
These transcendentals are that towards which each being is, bound, and towards which all transcendental subjective life is in living toward a life of truth and goodness. So this is then, in God then, or the idea of the idea of perfection. Here we don't have an essence when we're talking about these this eidos or which is God, because essences are in what Husserl calls the cosmos noetos, and this is Plato again, the world of ideas, the whole field of ideas. You can't have all of our concepts, all of our ideas unless they relate to other ideas. You can't have the idea, obviously, of a human being unless you have an idea of animality, of sentience, of consciousness, of intellect, of truth, and all that. All these ideas fit together, and you can't explicate any one idea without explicating the other. The idea of God for Husserl is not an essence, because an essence, in this sense, is finite. It's just one sphere or one aspect of being. Rather, it is beyond. It's irrelevant, non-relative to the rest, because it's absolute. It contains in itself everything. And he makes that point. He says there, it's an essence without horizontality, and which bears all true being in itself, because it is beyond the beings that are all finite and definable. So this is what we're talking about, that in that first formal frame, that we are maybe a phrase I kind of like is theomorphic. we're divinely shaped. We know from the Hebrew Bible that we're made in the image and likeness of God. So Husserl has his own version of that. Okay, now, but a part of this also is that the ideas are what enable what he calls a universal voluntarism. Now, this voluntarism, this sense of will, is not an act of will, but it's this basic tendency towards the divine ideas. That goes in advance of everything. And the most passive aspects of our lives, our conscious lives, there is this nisus, there's this tendency towards these infinite ideals. It comes up in the simple thing of where we're looking at something and it will invite us to see more of it. Anything will invite us to see more. And it's only because of practical reasons that we don't follow, say, that impulse. But and then in the most simplest things, in terms of what he calls passive synthesis, that for example, we spoke earlier about the two kinds of the common good. In the back of your mind now, it might be surfacing. How does that two notions of the common good that we spoke of earlier fit in with this common good? That shows that the nisus towards the idea is working, and you didn't do anything about it. That passive synthesis that is enabling you to think about it in these terms is a functioning of your being a form of time consciousness suffused, informed with rationality through the ideas. So the most feeble, simple acts of, and this comes out too, of course, in the basic experience of our will, that we prefer the good to what is non-good or to what is evil, obviously, but we also prefer the better to the mere good, and there's occasions when we certainly will prefer the best to the better. So this is not anything that we have to do. This comes to us, as it were, by being awake. And that shows for Husserl, there's a lot more to be said, but I'm going to call it there, cut it short here, that there is at the simplest levels of consciousness, this functioning of the ideas. And truth is the most important for me too, because we don't, the liar is dependent on truth. The self-deceiver is dependent on truth. We can't get away from truth. It's our most precious thing. And a chronic liar, a pathological liar, has got to be the most miserable of persons because he's dependent on the truth to be a good liar, and he's also being scolded constantly by him or herself that he's not following the depths of his nature, not being his or her true self. Okay, that's enough of that. Okay, now ethical love. We get to the second one then. Which is coming up, the second formal thing. Here we go now. Now this, I found this interesting. I won't spend time on this, but it's interesting that, and this comes away in something as Mahmoud said at the very beginning in his lovely introduction, the issue of the common life and ethical love is there from the beginning, even though love has other forms. But it's at the very beginning, and the very beginning that seems to be manifest is in the presence of what sometimes Husserl has said, but he's also denied the consistency of this, the presence of what he says sometimes as the other I. Now, insofar as I can only say I, and I can never and refer to me, and I can only refer to me by saying I, even when I refer to me in terms of a biography or an autobiography, I'm not referring to me as I does. I spent a lot of time with this, as you perhaps know, in who one is. We refer to ourselves in our core, and I've been arguing for some time now that this is a non-sortal unique essence. We're not individuated in this core sense of ourselves by being individuated, by being in time and space, by having such and such friends, being in such and such culture, having such and such language. When I refer to I'm referring to a radical individual. Now, when I meet another, one might say, well, there's another I, but that's not true. There is no other I, Husserl says. I am the unique I. But obviously, there's the other. And to perceive the other adequately or truly as you, I have to refer to what you refer to when you say I. And that can't be me. So I is it's a rich term, an indispensable term, seemingly, but at the same time, it poses all the problems. Now, I want to just dwell on this issue here a bit, that of the coming forth of the other I, because here is the beginning, in some sense, of the notion of ethical love. Well, first, let me say this: there's something about the presence of the other, which not only begins is the possibility for ethical friendship, but it's the whole unfolding, the bringing about of the other I in this strange act. Now, Husserl calls it Einfühlung. We translate that in English as empathy. Or sometimes he uses the phrase empathic perception. And what it clearly means is that I somehow am experiencing you or the other. I here now experience in you who are there and now. I experience in you one who is here. I experience in there one who is here for herself. I, who am radically unique, and I can't refer to myself by saying I'm a professor of philosophy, or I'm a Catholic, or I'm an old man, and I've married to Julia, and I've got a great dog called Ellie. That doesn't refer to what I refer to when I say I. I don't refer to any properties of mine when I say I. And when I refer to you, I'm not referring to, hey, you there with the, with the lovely eyes, or hey, you there who's a little overweight. I'm referring, if I'm referring to you and not referring to anybody in the third person, I'm referring to one who says I, and what I'm referring to what you refer to when you say I. So here we have this amazing thing of experiencing what we sometimes call another I, but that is a crazy expression in a way for Husserl too. And that's why we refer to the other with you, and I can't refer to the other with I. He can refer to him, herself with I. Now, this event, what he calls Einfühlung. Now, I must confess, he doesn't say all this stuff, and I'm pushing him hard on this, but I was moved to do this first off by Paul Ricoeur. As you know, he's kind of a giant in phenomenology, and he saw that the empathy was not merely an epistemic act, not merely a cognitive act. Empathy is a manifestation of the other, and is, as Simone Weil says, there is the radiance of the other. Now that's a poetic word, but it seems when we refer to persons and in the company of persons, it's not unlike anything else that we experience. Kant was insistent on this. When you meet a person, you're not ever meeting at a means to an end. You're not meeting a thing. You're meeting something which cannot be reduced to a means to the end. Now, teasing out why that is, because this is what the perception of through empathy entails. It involves meeting that before me in the world, which is not in the world any more than I'm in the world. The I is not in the world. g.hart's in the world, but g.hart as this identifiable person with this silhouette and this its interests and all these frailties and so forth. This is the I that knows this is not in the world, strictly speaking, in the way g.hart's in the world. Now they're the same. They're tied together. There's a complex relationship. But the transcendental I, what Tom Prover, my mentor, said was the dative of manifestation, the to which, and the I as the agent of they aren't in the world. And manifesting the world, I'm not in the world. And anything that's manifest is I am not manifest in that manifestation. And if I stick out my hand, that's the hand of the person that g.hart is, and that's in the world, and my manifesting the world, or pointing and things like that. But that's not the pointing itself is a manifesting, because I'm asking someone to look at what's being pointed at. And if you just focus on, like an infant, when you're just learning what Wittgenstein calls the language game of pointing, the infant has to learn that that's a skill. That pointing, the infant very well might focus on the knuckle, might focus on the nails, might focus on the hair, and miss the point that the parent is asking her to look beyond the finger to what's being pointed at, but the infant doesn't know yet what pointing at means. And so this way of manifestation through pointing is not pointing to itself. It's not self-reflexive, even though all manifestation is not self-reflexive, but self-manifest. This is a fundamental thesis of Husserl. Our intentional acts by which the world is displayed are themselves lived. They are selves. The world is brought to light by the intentional acts, but they are luminous in themselves, as is the self luminous to itself. And that's the great achievement and push Michel Henry and others have given us, and our friend Dan Zahavi, to awaken us to this non-relational, non-reflexive self-awareness. And that's what I meet with you. I meet one who can refer to herself, who is not in the world, who is there for me, but is not there for herself, but is absolutely not in the world, as a transcendental ego or as an I, and not comparable to anything else in the world. And Kant was absolutely dead right, calling a person never, always ends in themselves and never meets. But I want to make one more reference now. Recently, I don't know how, I think it's early 2000s, there was a fine book written by Stephen Darwall called The Second Person. It's a lovely book. He's an analytic philosopher, a student of John Rawls, I think, at Harvard. The second book, he makes enriches his conversation, and I think it's already actually in St. Thomas Aquinas. But he enriches his conversation by saying that the meeting of an I involves a unique ontological respect. Now, Fichte has this too, and Kant maybe a little bit too. So the act, what Husserl calls Einfühlung, empathy, is an act of respect, because the other is not there in the world for me as a thing. That distance from us has to be maintained for the other to be present to me, because if I collapse that other, that transcendence of the other, Husserl once said, the greatest transcendence in the world that we meet is the other. The transcendence of the glass, the transcendence of the other side of the building, the transcendence of the other side of the earth. These all can be circumvented. They all can be transgressed. I get in an airplane and I go to the other side of the world. I can go to the moon, but I can't transgress the transcendence of the other. That's a distance that, if that gets transgressed, he is no longer there. Just as I would be no longer there if I became utterly collapsed into the world, as a neuroscience would collapse me into the world in terms of firing neurons, cascading neurons. So we're spending time on this. Everything hangs on this. This awakening to the other, as you, brings about we, because I apperceive that you're not in the world, and I see that you are seeing what I'm seeing, but you're seeing from over there and seeing him from that angle, and I can't possibly from here see from that angle, but I see that you see from that angle, and I can say, I have to listen to you say, well, what are we looking at? And she says, well, this is a lawnmower. Oh, I said it. I thought it was a vacuum cleaner. Hmm. From here, it looks like a vacuum cleaner. So, okay, now we both see it for us as a lawnmower. You know, we've talked about it, and I've walked over there and see it. So we build up together a common world. Now that, of course, extends itself endlessly into people we meet, and then we slide into that. The world for us, when we're moving from our position to any position in the universe, is the world for us. The world is our res publica, insofar as its truth has to be true for us. So already we have an incipient sense of the republic, the res publica, in Husserl's writings, which is the world. And that's not even talking about the commons yet. Those goods which are commonly necessary. So, all right, we're going on now. Good. Now, so we got this. Then the second the second formal meaning of the common good, which is we. On the basis of the idea of perfection, of the divine perfection, and this nisus in us, in encountering other, then the natural wonder and the respect. That's all there. That can be, of course, more or less suppressed, but it can't be. If you're going to be contemptuous of another person, you still have to perceive that person as a person. You know, you can't be contemptuous towards a lamp, strictly speaking, or a rock when you stub your toe. That's contempt involves then the denial of the ontological dignity of someone else. That kind of attempt to morally annihilate that dignity which that person is due. And if we there's when the light goes on there, then we see the need, because we can distract ourselves. There is a problem with egotism. There's no doubt about it. But most of our most egregious sins or crimes still involve even murder. The destroying of another human being, if it's accompanied by hate or accompanied by disdain and contempt, or if it's accompanied by a habit, and this is what the military must necessarily do. The whole themes of video games. The military has a major task. It's a really morally and at best ambivalent task of reducing or even eliminating the human beings which are entrusted to the military, eliminating their spontaneous respect for others, because they bring to others weapons of elimination, annihilation. It's a funny business. I'm not arguing right now for pacifism, although that's my leaning. But I want us to see that even as the liar depends on truth, so the one who disdainfully kills another human being still is acknowledging this amazing truth of the dignity of the other, a dignity which is inseparable from the presence of the other. And this, of course, obviously is the basis for obligation. And it's quite different. Darwall makes that point very good. Stephen Darwall makes that point very well, that this respect we have in America, that wonderful, I don't know, you probably don't know her, but Aretha Franklin has a wonderful song, popular song called Respect, R-E-S-P-E-C-T. This is a respect that she wants to be respected on the basis of the kind of good person she is, what a good friend she's been, that she's earned respect typically. But it also might be that she's saying, no, you're treating me, as if I were a thing. But typically respect means earned respect, at least in America. And so you have athletes referring, to themselves, I earn respect out there, or I'm a tough guy, and if you don't respect me, then you're in for trouble, because I'll make you respect me, because I've earned your respect. So this is the kind of respect that we often think of, but Darwell is pointing to a respect as and this is part of Fichte too. I think I try to sort that out in the who one is. Fichte is Darwell saying, no, this initial empathy, this initial presencing of the other as the other is inseparably an act of respect. And that means then we open the door for another basic sense of the common good, which is namely what rights and laws are. They are our effort to set up protections and markers and pedagogical tools even for this basic most fundamental reality of our social being, that everybody is a person with this incommensurate value of being him or herself, and not eliminable and not exchangeable with anything. So in many societies, then I think the best way to understand what rights and laws are about are to protect the common good. What I want to talk about, let's see, what did I have to say? I'm getting ahead of myself here, but that's okay, I guess. Okay, let's go back to the ethical love, though. Mahmoud asked earlier about Shaler. Shaler's analysis are very good. Husserl recognizes that there is an epistemic, a noetic, a cognitive value to emotions. And Shaler was perhaps a little more eloquent on this, but certainly he was better known for this because Husserl's writings on these topics didn't come out, I think, until after his death. Ulrich Melle, I think, my friend Ulrich Melle brought out these writings on the of lust or being attracted to something. This says something about the perceived world. That quality of the perceived world is being brought out in our emoting to the world. So they're not just. Husserl has the claim, and this is where he and Shaler differ. And I think in part, Husserl always seems to affix the emoting act to what he calls an objectification. In some sense, not objectification in the sense of a reification and a degrading of what it is we're looking at, but we need an object in order to tie affective or positive or negative qualities to it. Shaler challenged that. He thought that the objects, there were whole ranges of objects which never came to light, independently of the emotions, and the kind of object it is would only first surface in love, and they would not come about in any ways by deducing the lovability of something by its objective properties. It's just the other way around. We wouldn't recognize these properties unless love went in advance. This is a rich topic, and I don't think I should spend much time on it here. But I think it's basic for our work here. Now, so we have this theme of persons being especially interesting, obviously, in the very act of presencing them respectfully, we might say. But we're drawn to them because we have already always in a community with them of the common world. And we're never been, if we only hear of feral children, children allegedly raised by animals, but our whole realm of being attracted to something is tied up with others with whom we have a common world. Now, the ethical life and Shaler and Husserl are both good in this, and Shaler especially points out that the love that we call the ethical love, or the fuller blossoming of love, is not merely being drawn to someone in terms of affection, of liking, of finding attractive. The ethical love is such that you self-distance yourself and take up the perspective of the other in his or her world, and you make space. That's this Roymond. You make space for the other to flourish. So this is a complexification of the initial act of empathy. You not only, Husserl would say, appresent the other, but you appresent her appresentation, his appresentation of the world, and within it the goals and the oughts, especially the oughts of that person. And parents do that all the time. They're always thinking about their person in the light of their best interest, we say, or the good that's most good for them, But the lover does that too. And so that means then there is a complex act of the other and the other's world. And then if you have a series of friendship and you have a community, you have this pole of poles again that we talked about. And the act of love, which is rooted in this obligation beyond the pleasure the other gives to me, but the other as an intrinsic good in herself, himself. It's not just for me, but it's her life, and her life is her horizon, is evident for her in his horizon of infinite horizon of the world, laced with, pervaded with goods and oughts, things that are to be heard to other things, a hierarchy of preference, and as in that person's life by the fact of her having the same ought I have to realize myself. And so, but if that, you can't then be turned into the moral monitor of that person. That's not loving the person. You become a pain in the butt. But you more so than anybody, you're motivated to bring that person into her own best possible life by the best possible adroit means, because you want what's best for her. Just a cognitive notion of what's best for him or her isn't going to cut it, because then you're not loving the person, you're becoming a disciplinarian through some abstract rules. So for Husserl, though, this has a natural kind of universality. The friendship moves necessarily to ever greater regions of friends that eventually have to encompass all of humanity, because we have a world in common by definition as eyes. And what I find, and I would start off on saying that, and I forgot it earlier, but what's so interesting about the rich notion of the presence of the other is how, as it were, tucked in there and burgeoning in there, is what we call the what do we call that, the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And then it's universal and apparently in all religions, but I'm thinking of it now as it's kind of the natural flowering of what's tucked into just the presence of another person. And I got some text here. I looked on Google, and I looked online, and I went through the tradition of the golden rule in Islam, and it's quite interesting there. You find numerous texts. There's a lot on there. And none of you, here's one from Al-Nawawi's 40th Hadith, 13 something or other. None of you truly believes until he wishes for his brother what he wishes for himself. This is really interesting. This is the Christians call it the two great commandments are inseparable. Here's another text from Sukhanan E. Muhammad. Seek for mankind that of which you are desirous for yourself, that you may be a believer. And another one here. That which you want for yourself, seek for mankind. The most righteous person is the one who consents for other people what he consents for himself, and who dislikes for them what he dislikes for himself. So I find this intriguing that this is basically implicit, it seems to me, in the appropriate presencing of another human being, what we call the golden rule. And it's natural to extend it to every other human being. And it's natural to see that if we're all connected, then our agency on behalf of ourselves is an agency on behalf of others. And then when we start thinking under the pressure of something like the nuclear wars or the climate change or the pandemic, we see that, and this it's so astonishing to Americans to hear, because we're all taken up with ourselves. We're taken up with being busy about our careers, ourselves, or just our families. And the idea that what's good for me is good for everybody. That I can act in a way which is good for me. I'm acting on the best for everybody. Or in acting on what's on the best for everybody, I'm acting on the best for myself. This is what the public health policy message is saying. And it kind of points to, because of one sense of the goods, the necessary goods, the necessarily common goods, that this is true. And so the universal ethical love is an unfolding of just what it means to initially present another human being. I think that could be spelled out nicely in more detail. So then we're at the second frame then, where we have the we. And the we is the correlate of the subjective divine pole idea, the subjective correlate, the analogous I-centering of the synthesizing of the manifold of I's as a plurality of datives, that's a mouthful, datives and agents of manifestation of moral relations. That takes over the simple point of how the I is a pole to itself, because I remember, I think, I forgot, I remember that I forgot, or I'm now talking, I'm now being silent, and then I remember that I was silent, or when I was silent, I should have been speaking. The I is a pole of all these different agencies of the I. And then when I become in contact with others, I'm in contact with a pole who has also this life spread out in space and time. And then when I come to a family get together, I have all these I's as poles, but I have them all together, and I have the togetherness of the family as a pole of all these I poles. But it's us. They're not all there as I's, hanging out there. No, as they're all datives of manifestation. They're all non-worldly subjects of the world, but they are able to be loved. Interestingly, Husserl says, in one act, one cognitive act, I can love the plurality that I embrace under love. And that act, which is possible with the family, he thinks can be naturally extended to humanity when one is thoughtful. And I suggest then, again, through the issue of the common goods, we see reasons for why that's a necessary move. That especially when we think of the commons, how we would all be annihilated if we didn't attend to the goods which are commonly necessary. Okay, now we've got time, huh? We're going along, okay?
If you have further points, we can keep going. But if you like, we can just discuss.
No, I'm good, but I'm afraid I'm putting everybody to sleep.
No, we're not going to sleep.
Okay. So, all right, this could have been done. All right, let's go to 4. Well, we spoke of 4 already. The rights is the means of securing and protecting the inviolable dignity revealed by respect's emergence with the presencing of the other as another I. So we talked about that briefly. I think my first introduction to these matters was reading Thomas Aquinas, a 13th century thinker. And I remembered I learned this by heart as a young seminarian. Law is a dictate of practical reason for the common good, made by one who legitimately has care of the community, and it has to be promulgated. They say it have to have public status. You can't have laws, put under your bed. They have to be published. So I think therefore, that's another sense of the common good, the protection of this basic dimension of the dignity of the others. And then I think that we have, we just run through these then. What I call the stuff and grace, that was the one we spent the most time on. The goods which have this ideality, which are essentially shareable, because they're essentially ideal or common, but they make up the stuff of our life. The things we would, if where we like to spend our free time, or say, what are we going to do today when we have free time? Now, often, I like to go hiking, and that's not one of these goods. It's another kind of good, and I wish everybody could go hiking, but you can't go hiking unless you live next to a woods or something like that. Or you can go walking anyhow, but you have a place to walk, and that has to be which goes most against materialism, because it feeds our spirit, and I think that's what I'd want to say about that. Okay, let's go to 6. We have these appropriate activities which bring about or help bring about the other goods. 3 to what an artist produces, what a carpenter produces, what a plumber does, what a mason does. All these are forms of good which are good for the commons, because they bring about these commonly necessary things like needing a house. Someone who cleans out the garbage lines, or the wastewater from your pipes when they're clogged. That is a wonderful service of the common good, because among all the common things, this water is near the top. So we have these ways in which the common goods are only possible by forms of labor, and thereby by extension become common goods. Then this is perhaps a point which should have been mentioned earlier, and it's really connected with universal ethical love. That's 6A here. The way I'd like to illustrate 6A, especially in the light of a context such as mine, which is loaded with the self-interest of capitalism, and why we can see that the richest life together is the life of community, is not in the life where it's true that we can all go into a museum as strangers and admire something that's beautiful, or we can all go to an orchestra as strangers and admire something that's beautiful. But think of how so much of that pleasure is tied up with knowing that other people are finding it beautiful. And if it weren't for the coming together of everybody, they say the concert would not have held, because we had to collect the money bring the orchestra here, something like that. Well, but I think it's for a way to illustrate what in obvious ways to illustrate that how the common life has a kind of exemplary form, which we're all deeply familiar with, but we don't apply it to our life together as a community in maybe the ways we should, but sometimes happens aside from ourselves. Now, I'm thinking America, as you might know, is sports intoxicated, but we have forms of where the common good, is embodied that should move the most hard-hearted capitalist sports advocate. And that would be then, it's true, we can regard something beautiful as a spectacle indifferent to our neighbors. But think of how, as an athlete, when an athlete does say in their events in sports, I used to play like basketball, and I know a little bit about soccer, and I know a little bit about and I'm more about baseball. But there are things like in basketball called the fast break, and in soccer there's something analogous. When there's an open field, the person has the ball, and there's only one defender, maybe the goalie or maybe one other defender, and both those players. Let's say there's two players involved who have the ball. They both each can say, "I want what he wants or what you want as you want it." But this is, I want what you want as you want it. This is love. And we both have a common goal, a common good, but it's brought about only by my wanting it as you want it, and you're wanting it as I want it. Otherwise, we're not going to kick the ball into the net. We're not going to shoot the ball into the net, and we're not going to bring home the home base this person on the double play, which I won't explain the double play to you. But love's like that. Love, as Aristotle says, friendship is having a life in common. It's having someone with whom you share a life in common. So you want what the other wants as the other wants it. But we have that in all of and the most obvious of love between partners. We have it, and it comes out today in our situation. We have the whole tens of thousands, maybe millions, but we have an awful lot of primary care workers risking their lives every day to keep the likes of me alive. And they get in emergency situations, which like where my brother was the other day. And the nurses and the doctors and everybody are working together, and they all have the same goal. And they're all acting in such a way that what they do is what the other wants them to do, and they have to do it the way the other wants them to do it, and they want to do it in such a way as the other wants that to happen that way. And there's this amazing reciprocity and communication of wills. And this is what Husserl's point of universal friendship is. We don't live outside of one another. We don't have wills existing alongside of and outside of one another. What community is where our wills are brought in to one another. They're intertwined with one another. And this is a capacity we have in fellowship, in love, and in I think what we the best is life at its best when we want what the other wants as he or she wants it. That doubles and triples our own life. But oftentimes the most important things in life can only be realized when we're in these intense relationships of what I have called here is 6A, activities requiring an interpenetration of hearts and minds in love and work, teamwork, which may or not bring about essentially common goods, but often they do, but which exemplify the richest form of we in the creation of community and therefore a good commonly desired. Okay. I think the rest is pretty easy now. Then we have the commonly necessary material human-made goods. So these are things we all need that have to be around for us if we're going to prepare the house. If we're going to get around, we need roads, we need bridges, we need farmers to harvest the soil. But here, especially our natural surroundings under 7A. Under 7A, we have then the what we referred to earlier as the commons, and this is what's of course endangered by climate change, and there's in our country, my country, there is there's climate injustice, we call it. There is the injustice of the people who suffer most from the effects of climate change. Very often are people in minority communities, the poor, the non-whites. Their houses are next to toxic waste sites. They have to live next to toxic waters. And so there's lots of when people are addressing the climate issue, it's also tied up with like the loss of the commons or loss of these common goods for the deprived parts of our society, my society. And then just
I'm sorry, Professor.
are we done?
Sorry. I'm really sorry to interrupt you. Could you please just conclude in 5 minutes?
Sure, sure. Well,
thank you. I apologize for that.
No, don't apologize. I hope I'm not putting anybody to bed. I can go on for a long time putting anybody to sleep. Well, one point I do want to find one that number 8 there is that I do think we have to recover the notion of leisure time, and as a common good. I mean, and we also, of course, spontaneously appreciate these necessary goods like rest and health, and so everything that's connected with these. But leisure is one, and the Greek word here got back to again this theme of that which is you do for its own sake, an activity which you undertake for its own sake, because it's the most beautiful thing to do, or it's the most lovely thing to be involved with, and that's what restores the soul. That goes back to number 5 too. But just to have a condition of being free for participation in these goods, I think is also something that political science has to advise. We have, the Sabbath. We have the day of rest. The chief topic for today, it seems to me, I mean, our day, and it was started in the 60s, but it got lost again. Because the 60s they were arguing, what are we going to do with all the leisure time? Technology has freed us, and you don't have people with the habits to undertake what the leisure is an activity for its own sake. To develop themselves, to get into thinking, to get into artwork, to get into activities which are intrinsically good and not merely good because they're useful for staying alive or helping people stay alive, and that was the 1960s, and bingo, technology found a way to do that. They found a way of keeping people poor. They found a way of having people work more today in the United States, middle class, having oftentimes 2 people have to earn a living for a household to be kept alive. So these other forces of finance and profit are behind the scenes often. And when we devise the commons and devise what fosters the commons, we have to devise a way of controlling these competing interests, especially the increasing wealth in the world, where a tiny minority is in control of most of the decisions that they should not be control of, because they make these decisions primarily towards their interests, leaving the rest of us out. So I'll stop with that. That's all.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your amazing, illuminating, and comprehensive lecture. I'm sure that everyone just enjoyed it as well as I did myself. And we now turn to the third part. See if anybody have any questions. Please type it in the public chat, so I can read it to the professor.
Do I have to do anything?
Sir Hart, I have something to ask.
Okay, go ahead, Hanish.
As I see and I read your books, there's an ontological importance for I and the way I is constituted. in the understanding in the your specific account of common good. So, regarding this importance, I want to ask you something about it and its possible political implications. Would you please just uh, clear if such a relationship can be imagined in the way you articulate the term common good?
Sorry, Hamid, I think your voice wasn't clear. So
No, yeah,
could you please, you heard it, Professor?
I heard, I heard, but I'm afraid you're dealing with an old man who's partly deaf, and the technology is not helping us either here. And I'm not sure it's not due to some external wicked influences, but I'm not going to go there now.
Okay, so in short, I think there is an ontological importance for I and the way it is constituted in
Oh,
your Husserlian understanding of common good. I just want to ask you about its possible political implications.
okay. Well, the I, I mean, Hamid, let me try and put it. You're wondering how this strange thing, this strange animal, so to speak, of phenomenology, the transcendental I,
Yeah,
can be integrated into political science and political considerations.
yeah,
So, okay. Well, I think
but ontologically, not in ontic politics. Ontic politics.
ontically. Ah,
No,
yes.
no,
Oh,
ontologically.
once again, ontically
I
or
want
Ontologically.
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 Yeah,
Yeah.
Ah, very good. Well, the as you know that in who one is, I developed that the referent of I, what we say I, is this non-sortal, uniquely unique essence. Hmm? And I developed at the end of volume 2 of that, I propose a theology, uh, which is that as all of creation uh, is a reflection of God, so, but there and there, but in God's essence, but in God's essence there are non-perishable essences, or that's there are eternal essences, and I ontologically, and this I think you'd find in in St. Thomas Aquinas, but you'd also find it in Meister Eckhart on medieval mystic. But I think you find it in. I'm trying to think of an Islamic source for this too. That we exist in the eyes of God before we're created. It sounds like double talk, but there is this because we belong to God's essence. And I don't know, that would be the most ontological or metaphysical version of what the I is. Hmm? The other ontological question that one can raise with regard to the I is, in terms of most understandings of ontology, is what is it? Hmm? Because if we think of it as a thing, substance with accidents, uh, then we individuate it by its accidents in space and time and so forth. But here we don't have a thing at all, and its individuation is, I call it non-sortal, meaning it's not a kind. I don't when I say I don't refer to myself being a white Caucasian male philosophy professor, who belongs to an imperialist country. I don't. That's all what I am, but it's not who I am. And so we have the area of the transcendental phenomenology, we have a unique essence. But there's the more basic question is that what is this realm, transcendental realm, within which everything appears? It's the way being manifests itself, and being does not manifest itself apart from agents of manifestation. And so what we have necessarily in Husserlian metaphysics, we never have dealing with, say, as Aristotle did, or Kant even, with a list of categories. These are all forms of manifestation. And so what we have in the phenomenological ontology or metaphysics, we have a kind of metaphysics. We have a metaphysics which has to understand manifestation as not mere manifestation, as if it were nothing substantial or nothing behind it, but as the light of being. Now, this is a theme that is in some, and I've got this from Olga Luchakova-Schwartz. There's an ancient Iranian philosopher whose name was Suhrawardi. Suhrawardi, do you know him? He was, I think, 10th or 11th century, and she introduced him to me. And what is interesting about that, and this is my inclination these days too, is to think about light in an ontological metaphysical sense. Aristotle, had a lot to say about light, and so does any physicist, or so does any philosopher of perception, and so forth and so on. But if what we mean by light is the manifestation of being, then the light that physicists or Aristotle spoke of is not the metaphysical light. We're talking about the light of mind. And in the absence of mind, light doesn't show anything. In the absence of mind or sentient beings, say like a squirrel or a bat, the moonlight or the sunlight, they don't reveal anything. There's no illumination. There's no display of being. Displays of being are only through agencies of manifestation. In our most familiar case, of course, is the human being, but we have to acknowledge there's our agencies of manifestation in marvelous ways by the whole animal realm. And so to make place for the I, we have to develop, I think, a sense of manifestation as an agency of illumination, and think of consciousness as illuminating, and think that the proper sense of a light as manifesting is to be found only in mind. Therefore, what I'm talking about, the sense of light, is not a metaphor, not an analogous sense. It is the proper sense. Because if we mean by light anything that displays something else, which shows something, which manifests anything, the natural light of the sun or the moon don't display anything in the absence of intellectual, or at least some sort of sentient consciousness. Am I getting warm? Am I getting close?
Yes, why I ask this? As you may know, H. Peter Steeves bases his moral categoriality, which can be said a sort of ontology of morality, on your understanding of manifestation. He starts from I relation, ego in Husserl, and goes to common goods. And he is, as he writes in his founding community, in depth with your project. I wanted to see, as he mentions, and as I believe, can we talk about ontology without metaphysics, as you said, some kind of ontology which starts with I related to the word I as ego, as Husserl mentions, without going to metaphysics. Does it makes any sense?
Yeah. Well, I think that's been actually, Hamid, I think that's been the tendency of the phenomenological movement. um, to do, to comment on or supplement Husserl's work with forms of ontology. And that was the work, of course, of the early phenomenologists, earliest bright students like Shaler, or he wasn't so much a student, but Konrad Martius, the great philosopher of nature, Roman Ingarten, the Polish philosopher. They all wrote, I think, Adolf Reinach, who wrote that wonderful book on rights, which is of great interest to your department there in the phenomenology of rights. I think that's what he calls it. They all wrote, they did, I think, more ontologies than metaphysics. I think, though, if metaphysics has to do with being, and at least says Aristotle, and I think we can even push Plato in that direction too, being in an extended sense, which includes the good. And I think that what we find in the ancients, this connection of being with the true, this inseparability, which means as one medieval said, there's what we have with the truth is the manifestation of being. And so this is a new kind of metaphysics, which has to include the agency of manifestation as in terms of elaborating the meaning of being. I think we could do, as many have done, even Shaler perhaps, we can have an ontology of the person, how it was developed by Shaler in Konrad Martius and Helmut Plessner, where you have a difference worked out between, say, animal consciousness and human consciousness, and you have then the whole realm of, like Konrad Martius works out, the whole realm of the plants and the molecular world and the whole realm of entelechy and what development, evolution, of ontologies, and you would never get around to this theme and manifestation. And you could even have a sense of the I, as an ontological consideration, because after all, first-person reference is able to be talked about without having a transcendental sense of being as inseparable from display. So you could have an ontology of the person without this thinking of this transcendental dimension as a metaphysical dimension. Am I being clear, or am I getting too vague?
Yeah, okay. And the last question, I used to not to translate the term subjectivity in Farsi, because I think subjectivity is a possibility of being subject.
Okay.
And if we cannot translate subject, we cannot translate subjectivity too. Let me just explain it. When I talk in empathy or emphatic perception about perceiving the other's ego in an empathic perception, I think I perceive him or her as me, as a subject, as a possibility of constituting or experiencing the world as I do. Yeah. So I cannot understand. I don't have access to the content of him or her, but I know that he or she experiences as I do.
Yes.
So talking about subjectivity is talking about this possibility, not her or his mind, not her or his agency or something like this. So am I right to say that subjectivity is a possibility, so it cannot be translated in mind or, I don't know, spirit or something like this?
Well, I let me go back. I think that you're saying something certainly very important, namely, I don't experience you're experiencing. and and when I refer to you, in my referring to you, I refer to you. I'm referring to what you refer to as I, but I don't experience you first personally as you experience yourself. But I get a categorical uh, uh, I get a category here of subject or subjectivity, and when I'm experiencing your behavior, let's say you're speaking or you're walking or you're crying, uh, I don't think we want to say that I'm experiencing you as merely possibly first personally crying or talking or perceiving. I experience you as actually perceiving, but I don't experience your experiencing of your perceiving. And does that get closer? Because I don't know what else to say about that right now. Did I miss the point?
I got it. I got what I wanted. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, it was a good question. Thank you.
Thank you. Mahmoud.
Okay, Professor, I know you're tired now, and
getting there.
Yeah,
getting hungry too.
Yes, and we don't want to bother you more.
No, wait. Come on. If you have a little more time, I can spend it if you've got a question. Mahmoud, do you have a question?
Okay, the last question. I will ask you about the actually the alternative for representative democracy from the standpoint of ethical phenomenology of Husserl. What do you think about the alternatives? As I read before, you have this theory about anarchic communism.
Yes, that's an inflammatory expression, but it's yeah, I think I'm inclined towards that. And the reason is because I'm inclined towards community. And there's a great difficulty with community. Aristotle even said this. If you have, I don't know, he didn't give a number, I don't think, but Aristotle said you can only be friends with a few people. And I think you can only have a community with a few people. You could only have a discussion, in his sense, in the polis to settle the common concerns and create the common good, a discussion among a finite number of people. You can't have a conversation with 1,000 people or even 100 people, So there's a limit on that. And that raises the specter and the very deep and serious problem of representationalism. And we need it because we have millions of people, billions of people. And how do we, and this is the great challenge, I think, of political science and social ethics and so forth. Just a footnote to these anarcho-communism. In northern Syria right now, of interest, I taught in the personal common life. I think I refer to Murray Bookchin. You ever hear of him, Murray Bookchin? He's a Brooklyn philosopher, and who is a critic of modern democracy as it's tied to capitalism, and behind the scenes there is this figure I mentioned earlier of Mumford. We're moving towards the rule by technocrats and the military from the top. That'd be the worst case scenario, the nightmare, and then what Mumford calls the mega machine. So. And that's because the messiness of democracy, the messiness is, and Aristotle felt it was impossible. But I just want to put a parenthesis in here that in northern Syria right now, there's a group of influenced by Murray Bookchin. They're in an area called Rojava in northern Syria. If you go to Google and type in Murray Bookchin and the Kurds, you'll come across then this society that I think his name is Akala, this Bookchin disciple, established the society, and there's radical, in this Islamic community, there's radical equality of women and everybody, and it's a democracy. And Erdogan in Turkey has been trying to exterminate this group, and the Russians and the Syrian military have been trying to exterminate them too, but they've carved out for them a little piece of land. I'm afraid they're not going to last unless people take interest in them from other parts of the world. But in any case, it's that experiment that I find edifying. But there are lots of experiments going on, and I think what we have to understand, we can't turn into a multiplicity of isolated, anarcho communities. I think that's a mistake. However, we have to realize that if we don't have self-rule in a democratic sense, and we don't have forms of representation that are, and it's always going to be flawed. It's always going to be in danger. But I think our experiment as a human community can be much more humane and much more in line with the ideals of ethical humanity, and always with an eye to the common good, by having communities of communities of communities. So a community of communities of community, but working out the proper structure of representation, where the top never suffocates the bottom, or is in a position to suffocate the bottom, and where the bottom is always also responsive. It has to be educated. Education is so important, and the old-fashioned liberal education, and just which we get so much from Plato. If we don't have a bottom level, we get what Aristotle called the mob. But if we have, but we have to have our democracy. First of all, it has to be finite, because we can't have a conversation about the common good with 1 million people, and say an interpretation of the common good, say with respect to a particular body of water, and so forth. But we live within a larger community, and that larger community is within a larger community. And so working out, and the United Nations is a wonderful experiment, but it's absolutely necessary. And there was a time before I was born when there was no United Nations. But right now its relationship with the base and the cooperation of all the people is in danger. So it's not only building up the United Nations, it's building up a sense of democracy from below. And that building up then with the skills of the political scientists, I think that it's those folks that have to be working on the finessing representation of systems of representation, or I suppose I would say a poll of polls. And having a threshold for messiness and irrationalities and so forth, but we can do much better than we're doing, and we may not lose sight of the various senses of the common good. I don't know if I answered your question, Mahmoud.
Thank you very much. Of course, it was clarifying. Thank you, Professor. I think it was the idea of communities inside another community was the very idea of the United States in early days. But
yes.
Yes. As Alex de Tocqueville saw it, and
exactly.
But looks it didn't come out very well.
Capitalism has made strides in a way, as it's even made strides to the extent that it's almost a moral taboo to criticize it, to apply moral categories to capitalism. It doesn't happen, and even at universities, because universities are we go back to the problem of the commons, are endowed by Wall Street. And so the necessary discussion. But we have to have political science, the details too. There are lots of nitty gritty details. Proudhon, I think, said, that representation is theft. I know what he's saying, but that's true and false. If it means it's false, if it means that we can dispense with it. I don't know how we can dispense with it if we're going to live in the world with others, and we have to live in the world. And now, like with the pandemic, we see, and with the climate change, we see the need, the universalization. We're looking at humanity as a universal community. We have to do it. And if we don't, we're going to kill one another.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you for your precious time.
And it's been a joy. Thank you. I've enjoyed it. You gave an old man, it. You gave an old man some energy to return to one of his favorite themes. So I hope we meet again.
Yeah.
I hope we meet all.
Surely in another meeting, if you honored us. Yeah.
Oh, it'd be fun. Maybe we'll talk about my Lucifer project.
Of course. It's a great subject. Yes.
I worry about nuclear war. I worry about it. Thanks, you guys. I appreciate it. Thank you very much. I hope to see you again. And if you're in Bloomington, come and see me. I'll buy you all a big dinner.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Bye now.
Thank you. Bye now.
Bye.
Bye.